Hello, I'm Tony Antolini. It's very nice to see you. We, of course, can't really see each other, but I'm pretending you're all here as you have been in past summers. Each talk that I give before these concerts will be approximately 45 minutes, and the musical examples will not be played in the middle of the talk. Instead, we have a new idea. We will have the examples, if there is time for much of that, at the end of each talk, and while the examples are playing, you will see pictures of the performers so you can imagine who they are when you hear the actual concert. The music that you hear in this series will all be taken, the examples will be taken from the archives of Bay Chamber concerts. These are not samples taken from some other source. There are many resources that you can have at any time that you would like to add to your enjoyment of this experience, and they are free. Most of them are free. Never forget the great value we have of YouTube. YouTube performances include all kinds of wonderful videos where you can see the performers playing. There is, of course, also the subscriber series such as YouTube Music and Spotify, but you don't have to spend money on that if you don't feel like it. For those of you who are interested in a truly educational experience, if you use Google and type in the name of the piece, you can find sometimes, in many cases with this repertoire, the score, and you can watch the score as you listen to the music. It's a great way to sharpen your music reading skills. So I'm going to be gesturing to my assistant, whom you cannot see, but who would certainly deserve applause if you could give it, and that's Josie Davis. She is doing all of the production work for these presentations. Now, usually when we meet, we have questions and answers at the ends of these series. And I'd love to be able to have your questions, your comments, and so I'm giving you now on the screen an opportunity to see how to get in touch with me. You can email me, and if I understand the technology, you can hear my voice and see the slide at the same time. I'm also on Facebook Messenger, and even though we can't have live questions and discussion, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you and hear any suggestions you may have. So, our first piece to discuss in this series of classes is a work that is considered in many respects one of the great monuments of Baroque music by Johann Sebastian Bach. I'm not going to take any time to talk about who Bach was, or how many children he had, or how many places he lived, or how far he walked to hear other musicians, because you can easily find out all about that, and you've probably heard those stories before. So we'll go right to the piece in question, which is the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 in G. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the works of Bach, you see a number listed in a program that says BWV. That stands for Bachwerkeverzeichnis. Bachwerkeverzeichnis means Bach Works Catalog. And the numbers that you see have nothing to do with when Bach wrote it. They are fairly arbitrary numbers. So, the Bach Brandenburg Concerto is number 6 in all. There are different orchestrations for each one. So the one that we are going to hear in this performance is strings only. The 6 concertos were dedicated to Christian Ludwig, who was Margrave of Brandenburg. That's how they got the name Brandenburg. So what you'll see here, if you were to see a performance, is a group of string players numbering 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, and a Baroque system called continuo. Now, continuo means a harpsichord player and a string player who is playing a bass line along with the harpsichord. This, of all 6, is the shortest and it lasts 10 minutes. Bach, as you know, wrote a tremendous amount of music. But what is interesting about this particular time in his career is that it's a time when he was concentrating on instrumental music. He was director of music for a prince in a German city called Köthen. And the Prince Leopold, required mostly orchestral and chamber music. This was not a place where church music was required. The church practices in Köthen were very Protestant at the time, and they didn't want cantatas or masses or anything like that. So this is a period of time when some of Bach's greatest instrumental works were composed. The Well-Tempered Clavier, which is a very important work for any keyboard player. It's now something piano students learn, but it was originally written for harpsichord. There are also many other harpsichord works written at this time, and clavichord. Clavichord is like a harpsichord in looks, but the inner workings of it are a little different. It's kind of the predecessor to the piano because the strings are struck, where with a harpsichord they're actually plucked by little devices called plectrum. Chamber music was also a big part of Bach's life. The only vocal works that Bach wrote during this time was when the prince had a birthday or at New Year's, but you'll notice there is no sacred music represented here. The movements of this piece are very interesting and unusual because of what Bach doesn't give the performer as opposed to what most composers give. In the first movement, he gives no idea of how fast it should go. So the speed of the performance is going to be determined by the players, and with amateurs, usually the speed is determined by how fast they can play it without going off the track. Now, there's some things to notice about this type of music if you're unfamiliar with the Baroque concerto grosso. That is an Italian term which refers to the idea that there is a big ensemble and a little ensemble. So you will hear groups of players within the entire assembly playing, as opposed to everybody, usually referred to in Italian as tutti, which means everyone. The other thing you'll notice is that the music is characterized with a refrain, which in Italian is called a ritornello, which literally means a little returning thing. And so you will hear a familiar melody at the beginning of a section, and then the music will go to a contrasting idea, and then the ritornello will come back as a kind of refrain similar to what you would hear in a folk song. Bach lived at a time when there were no copyright laws. So it's very interesting to notice that Bach freely borrows from himself, and he got a good idea, and nobody could take him to court for using his ideas over again. In this particular movement, the first movement of the Brandenburg Third Concerto, he saw that he had really quite a good tune, and so he recycled it into one of his cantatas. This one is Cantata 147. Ich liebe den Höchsten von ganzem Gemüte. I love the Lord, the highest, with all my heart. And in order to make it a little bit different, he added wind parts. So if you ever listen to the Bach cantatas, listen to 174, and you'll hear a tune that should be oddly familiar. Now, the word concerto is confusing because later in music history, a concerto usually refers to a superstar standing in front of an orchestra or sitting at a piano in front of an orchestra and playing alone, as opposed to the big orchestra accompanying. But in the Baroque period, this is not the way it works. You'll hear a few places in this piece where one player plays, but that's not really the point. It's more this large versus small, this group versus this group, that creates the variety. The second movement is the oddball here. If you look at the actual printed music, it's very puzzling because only 2 chords appear there. Several years ago, I had the pleasure of conducting this piece at Bowdoin College because I had a wonderful harpsichord student. And I looked at the score and I said, Henry, what are we going to do with this? Oh, he said, don't worry about it. We'll just play 1 chord and then I'll improvise and then we'll get to the end of it and I'll play the other chord. So that's usually what happens. And I don't know in our performance here at Bay Chamber whether the 2 chords will be played and they'll get on with the next movement, but I doubt it. So some musicologists assume that there should be some kind of improvisation. The word cadenza comes into this, which is usually something improvised at the end of a concerto movement. But you may compare with other performances you see on YouTube, and in some cases they're just 2 chords and they go right on with the fast movement that follows. This is the hardest movement to guess what's going to happen, so pay close attention and see how long it lasts. Now, on the 3rd movement, we get back to what Bach actually wrote, and there is no improvisation at all. And what you will hear in this case is a display of fantastic virtuosity. The players are whirling around, and the point of it all is that you are performing here music that is a display of the greatest virtuosity. So I'm quite sure you will hear a stunningly fast tempo. Now, earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that there was the use of a ritornello, that's the refrain. Here you will really get a very good sense of what the ritornello is, because as the music wanders somewhere else, then it comes back to the ritornello. Now this form is inspired, and we will hear quite a lot about this also in other Baroque works. It's inspired by dance movement. All of these movements that in Baroque pieces often sound like something you could get up and dance to are indeed inspired by that, but it isn't dance music. It's inspired by that kind of style. So now you will see the performers of this piece, and while you are seeing who they are, you will get a foretaste of what this piece actually sounds like. I'd be willing to bet most of you have heard it many times before. Now we turn to Mozart, and again, with some gigantic composers such as Mozart and Bach, I don't think it's really appropriate for me to take your time telling you something that you probably already know, and if you don't know all about Mozart's fascinating life, you can easily find a treasure trove of materials about him. So we'll go right to the piece that is featured on the second half of this concert, and that is the Clarinet Quintet in A major, K581. Here again we have these mysterious numbers, and K in this case stands for a cataloger who is responsible for making a kind of serial number system for Mozart's works, and that is a musicologist named Köchel. So the K number 581 also is not like an opus number. It does not indicate when he wrote it or what order. The K numbers are more oriented toward genres of his music. Now, this quintet has a nickname called the Stadler Quintet, and it's named after a man named Anton Stadler, or in German, Stadler. Stadler was quite a character. If you read about Mozart's life, you discover that Stadler was, first of all, very well celebrated as the greatest clarinetist in Vienna. He played in the court orchestra there. But he was a personal friend of Mozart. Mozart was a Mason, and Stadler also was a member of that fraternal order. But Stadler was not just a friend and a great clarinet player. He was actually quite a scoundrel, a rogue. And he was really, if we just put it bluntly, he was a moocher. He would camp out at Mozart's house when he had no place to stay, and he borrowed money from Mozart, which indeed was not a great idea, because if you know about Mozart, he didn't have a whole lot of money ever. So to have a moocher friend who would borrow money from him and not repay it is indeed not a cool thing to do. But Mozart was devoted to him and knew that he could press the limits of clarinet playing of the time. And so he took advantage of this and wrote a piece that, at the time, Stadler was one of the few people that could really bring it off. It was completed in the fall of 1789 and was premiered at the Royal Court Theatre in Vienna in December of that year. So what you're going to hear in this piece is basically a string quartet with added clarinet. And the sound that is created here, we take very much for granted. But it's important to try to put yourself back in time, if you could have a time machine. The clarinet at the time this piece was written was really quite a marvel to people. There are no clarinets in the Baroque period, for example. If you go back to the works of Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi, you'll never find a clarinet part. So the clarinet is kind of a new sound to people's ears. And so Mozart is in a position here to really show it off. And so there are some other works where you can hear this, and I encourage you, if you're a clarinet fan, to look also at the Kegelstadt Trio, and Mozart also wrote some other works for Stadler. You can find, if you Google Mozart clarinet chamber music, something like that, you will find other examples of this. So we have here a fairly standard four-movement work. But since this is Mozart, and Mozart is an experimenter, he's not only pushing the limits of what the clarinet can do, but he's also playing around with the sonata form. So Since some of you may be listening for the first time, I'm going to take a moment or two to mention the sonata form, because this is going to come up over and over again whenever we discuss chamber music. The sonata form is really basically born in this classic period, and what it involves is a presentation of two ideas, usually, two musical ideas. Most of the time, these two musical ideas create a kind of comparison or contrast. In this particular piece, Mozart pushes the form into an experimental phase by having three themes instead of two. But getting back to the basics, the sonata form presents these two ideas, musical ideas, and then, having presented them, most of the time the composer will repeat this section. And the repeat is a literal repeat. So you will see two bar lines and two dots on each part, and that means go back to the beginning and play it again. Now, there's a reason for this. The composer wants to familiarize the listener with the two contrasting ideas. And the best way to familiarize anybody with something new is to repeat it. The playing of those two ideas and the repeating constitutes what's called the exposition. And later, as we work with these forms, you will sometimes see I use the term expo, but that's referring to the first part of the sonata form. After the expo, we get a kind of musical mix master where the ideas are put into all kinds of experimental playing around with the themes. They can be played differently, they can be played sometimes together. An idea in a theme could be expanded. There is no rule for what the development does, except to play around with these ideas. After the development is completed, there is a section known as a recapitulation, which in many of my slides will be called the recap. And just as we use the word recap in conversation, it is a way of describing something over again just to review it. A recapitulation is seldom a literal repeat of the exposition, but rather those musical ideas are presented once again, sometimes in a shortened form, but it's kind of like seeing an old friend, and by this time you've heard enough of these two musical ideas that they really become quite recognizable. Now, I'd like to draw a comparison between the sonata form and something that many of us really enjoy here in Mid-Coast, Maine in the summertime, and that is sailing. Or, if you're not a sailor, you could think of it as a sea kayak trip. And here's what happens. We get into our boat, whatever kind of boat it is. It could even be a lobster boat. And we head out of the harbor. We're in the exposition form, a part of our sea journey, and we notice two particular sites that help us get our bearings. Let's say one of them is an island and the other is the dock where we just cast off. And we sail out of the harbor, and as we sail out of the harbor, we look around and refamiliarize ourselves with these two points of reference, the island and the dock. And at that point, we have had our exposition. We sail out of the harbor and out into open water, and we may, from that perspective, see the dock or the island, or we may see mostly the island, and we may see some new things like some buoys. We may see some other islands that look a little bit like the island that is one of our expo islands. And we sail around out there, and maybe the wind comes up, and it may get a little wild, and we may even get a little bit scared. This is the point of our sea journey where we are adventuring. This is our development. And after a while, we decide we've had enough of this, and it's time to sail back into the harbor because we've had enough excitement for the day, and we're getting pretty wet and cold. We sail back into the harbor, and we see the island and the dock, and they look very familiar now because we saw them twice as we sailed out of the harbor, and we could kind of see them as we were out in the open water. But now it's really familiar because we're sailing back to them, and that's the recapitulation. And we tie up the dock, and that's the end of our sonata movement in our boat. So now let's talk a little bit about what Mozart does in this Allegro form. We have here a very interesting three idea aspect instead of two. So in Mozart's little voyage, we have a dock, an island, and a buoy. This is not what most composers do, but of course Mozart is a kind of free radical of his own devising. And in the development, when we're out there in the open water, you will hear the instruments playing different combinations, a little bit like what we had with Bach Brandenburg earlier in the concert. When we go back into the harbor and have the recap, we hear all three themes again, but they're not quite the same, just as that view as we sail back into the harbor is not quite the same, because we're coming from another angle. So we really have a different angle on Mozart's three ideas. Now we'll go to the second movement. This is called a Larghetto. Larghetto is an Italian term that means kind of slow. The Italian word for slow would be largo or adagio. A Larghetto is a kind of slow movement. And what Mozart is doing here is creating a forum for the clarinet soloist to play a lovely melody. And you get a lot of Italian terms when working with music. That's a convention. If you don't like the Italian language, you're going to miss an awful lot of musical terminology. And arioso is a kind of song. It's borrowed from the vocal literature. And when you hear this movement and hear James Campbell play this opening melody with the strings muted in the background, you'll find out what an arioso is. Eventually, the violin and the clarinet get into a kind of conversation here. But what's interesting is that Mozart is still adhering to a traditional form, even though we're dealing here with two ideas rather than three. Sonata form is still plainly obvious. You will hear in exposition. The two ideas then are experimented with in the development, and then a return to those two ideas at the end of the movement. Now let's go to the third movement. Here we have a very different kind of musical form, and again Mozart indulges in his love of experimentation. The third movement traditionally in a lot of chamber music and symphonic music is called a minuet and trio, and a minuet in Italian is a menuetto. Minuet is a dance, and the trio form is a misleading term because people assume that a trio would involve only three people. But the trio in the minuet and trio form is simply a contrasting section. Now this all comes from the world of dance. At the time of the classic period, minuets were a very popular dance form, and there is no mistaking the fact that here you can picture people dancing, even though Mozart didn't write this as dance music. Now, ordinarily, if Mozart were not an experimenter, what you would get here is a minuet, a dance tune, and then a contrasting section, which also is dance related but different musical idea, and then a return to the minuet. And it's often referred to in form as a minuet and trio. If you were interested in diagramming it, it is basically an ABA form. Now, Mozart isn't satisfied with the ordinary, and in fact, that's one of the things that made him so famous. He takes the minuet and trio and creates a second trio. So what he gets is minuet, trio, return to minuet, new trio, return to minuet. So if we were to diagram this one, it would be A, B, A, C, A. The trio in the first instance here moves from the major to the minors. So instead of do, re, mi, you get do, re, mi. Notice what that does to the mood of the piece. The minuet returns, and Mozart follows dance convention here. Minuets have a lot of repeats in them, minuets and trios. When players play them, they have to really keep their mind on where they are. If your mind wanders, you might forget whether you've played a certain section a second time or not. I've been stuck in that situation sometimes when I've been involved in vocal minuets and trios, and I think to myself, did I do this already? So, of course, you won't see any errors in this performance because the people are really on top of it. But it's something to remember when you've got a lot of repeats, and which repeat do you go to, and how many times have you played it, that goes through a performer's head. We get to a second trio here, and there's no question about the fact that Mozart is enjoying playing a game here. This happens a great deal in his music. He is writing classical music for people who pay money to a famous composer, but he's playing music that imitates the popular music of his time and sounds exactly like a peasant dance. For you, as a 21st century listener, you could easily stand up and waltz to this tune. We then get the minuet one more time, and the movement is completed. So now we get the final movement, which is an Allegretto con Variazioni, which means a kind of fast movement with variations. This form is very, very old. You can see it all the way back to Renaissance times with dance music, even with songs. The theme is presented, and then some kind of contrasting section comes up, and the contrasting section isn't new material, but a kind of experiment with the tune, and then the tune may return, or the tune may continue, and in each iteration of it, the tune is experimented with in some way. So unlike the minuet and trio, where you get something new, here it sounds new, but if you listen really closely, you'll see there's a connection that holds it all together. This is a form that is still very popular in 21st century composition. And if you've ever had piano lessons or violin lessons, or you've listened to a lot of classical music, you can't escape this form. Now, even if you're not a classical music fan, you need to realize that the form of theme and variations is also how jazz is organized. If you hear a jazz combo, they will play a familiar tune, or maybe it's not familiar, but you get familiar with it as you listen to it. But let's say it is a very familiar tune. Let's just imagine a tune like some famous tune that you could even sing along with. And after you've heard that tune, it goes to different members of the jazz combo who elaborate on that tune. Now, what are the other people doing in the combo? They are not just inventing something. They keep in their heads the chord progression of the original tune as the soloist experiments with it. And that's exactly what Mozart does here, except instead of improvisation, it's all written out. There are 6 variations, and some of them are much easier to track to the tune. So when you first listen to this, listen to the statement of the tune carefully, and that will give you an idea of how the tune goes. You will notice the tune most obviously in the 1st, 4th, and 5th variations. Now, in the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th variations, the tune is experimented with more. So you would have to concentrate a little harder to discover the tune. But the tune is always there. It never goes away. The melodic, the harmonic form of the tune is undergirding what's going on, even though the melodic content may seem to vary. It's always lurking in the background. And if you play this piece several times, maybe even twice, this particular movement will create what many people call an earworm, because after you turn it off, it will continue to go on in your head. Now, this performance features the St. Lawrence String Quartet. It is a Canadian ensemble which was founded in 1989, but they have not stayed in Canada. They've been all over the place. They've been in residencies in Juilliard, at Yale, University of Toronto, Hart School, and at Stanford University in California. So the players in the group are Jeff Nuttall, Owen Dalby, Leslie Robertson, Christopher Constanza, and if you're interested in that group, I encourage you to Google St. Lawrence String Quartet. They even have some free downloads that you can listen to. And there they are. Also on this performance is a very famous clarinetist who is also a Canadian. His name is James Campbell, and he has been teaching since 1988 at the Indiana University, the University Jacobs School of Music. So I hope you enjoyed hearing these players collaborate. It was indeed a great evening in Rockport, Maine. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll tune in again next week.